Hello and welcome to a special edition of Global Fleet Voices video series produced by Automotive Fleet Magazine. And this video series is designed to put a spotlight on key leaders in global fleet management. And today I have the honor to interview Keith McLaughlin, publisher of Canadian Automotive Fleet, who's going to talk to us today about the Canadian fleet market. So Keith, how are you?
Well, Michael, I tell you, I'm all the better for speaking with you, young man.
Terrific. We're glad that you had the opportunity to spend some time with us and give us some update on the Canadian market. And so let's get right into it. What are the current fleet market conditions in Canada? And, as with everybody, the Canadian fleet market has been dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. How have Canadian fleets been dealing with it?
Sure. Well, I'll start maybe from a macro position, and I'll move down. It won't take too long to go through it all. So in Canada in 2020, total light vehicle sales came in at about 1.54 million units. It's down 20% over 2019 sales, which is actually quite remarkable given the amount of disruption and the amount of economic devastation that the virus has created.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm gonna preface all my comments by giving one quick anecdote, and that is asking about kind of market conditions. And to answer that, I'll use the anecdote. And it's when Canadian law enforcement and Canadian security personnel are seizing Canadian citizens coming back from traveling and then taking them without due process to a quote unquote, I'm using my scare quotes here, to a detention center without any due process or even access to other family members. I'm going to say that market conditions here are uncertain.
Wow.
But moving right along then, one of the things that's really interesting, and it's again a progression of a trend that's already been happening, is if you look at those light sales, 80% of them were light truck. So the breakout between passenger car and light truck is 80-20. And of course, in that 80% is the very popular compact, subcompact CUVs, crossovers. But Canadians still have a love affair with their large trucks and their large SUVs. Mm-hmm. When it comes to the fleet market, market conditions here are, again, they're uneven. There are some segments of the fleet market that have done quite well, especially if you look at the companies that have been deemed essential by governments and provinces. So anything that's a vocational fleet, a service fleet, they've been able to stay in operation. They've had to make some significant changes to deal with COVID-19 sanitation and safety requirements. So we've seen growth of the short-term rental market as you've gone from putting 4 people in a crew cab to putting maybe 2 or even 1 and needing extra vehicles to get staff and crew to the job sites. Probably similar to the US, we've seen that last mile delivery business has just gone stratospheric. And given market conditions and what's happening and what may happen going forward, there doesn't seem to be any decline in that. The market, though, is kind of like Dickens' Tale of Two Cities. It's the best of times and it's the worst of times. And I know later on we're going to be talking about some of the regional differences in Canada, and that's where we're seeing a pretty big disruption in the Western market because of the decrease and decline in the oil and gas business. But over in the Ontario, Quebec market, which is more of a manufacturing, finance, technology market, they have managed to escape some of the devastation that's hit the Western Canadian markets. But overall, just check my notes, the big impacts for Canadian fleet operators are similar to the ones that we've been talking about that we're seeing in the States. There are product shortages. We're seeing very tight ordering windows. We're seeing inventory challenges. We're seeing, which are caused not just by the OEM's production disruptions earlier last year, but also now by part suppliers. So you may have an order in And then you'll get a notice saying, well, we can't build it because the part that we need for that tailgate or for that airbag or for that nav system isn't available. So we're delaying and then sometimes canceling orders. Certainly the semiconductor challenge is putting extraordinary pressure on all automotive markets. And Canada, as a small market, tends to get kind of the short end of the stick on a lot of these subjects. So I think all of the product issues that you're seeing in the States, you're seeing in Canada in spades.
Yeah, it's remarkable how much similarity there is between the two markets. It's very. I could have given the same speech, but just instead of saying Canada, I would have said the U.S. So there are those similarities. We're about 20% down in our overall volume. Also, it's kind of remarkable considering the amount of disruption that it's only down that much. There's been a little bit of uptick going on, but we've had a very strong retail market, so that's really caused a lot of early order cutoffs. So a lot of the orders being placed now are coming in as 2022 models. But you touched upon one point that a lot of people outside of Canada might not realize is, you're a huge country, and as a result of that, there are regional differences between the provinces in terms of their economies. And you kind of touched upon the Western provinces versus what's going on in the Eastern provinces. I'm wondering if you could build upon that more. And explain to the viewers just exactly how these regional differences play out in terms of the fleet market.
Oh, absolutely. So depending on how you define it, Canada can be up to 6 regions, and there's certainly 3. And to not complicate matters, but I guess it does, we also have 2 languages. So we've got the entire province of Quebec, which is French language dominant, versus the rest of Canada, which is English language dominant. And to that end, as Canadians, we've probably not done as good a job as we should have to make everybody in this country bilingual, which is kind of our official language policy. So that sets up some distinctness right there. Then you've got the differences between the Western provinces, and you can bunch even the coastal province of BC into it. But generally, the Western provinces are defined as Manitoba, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, and they are heavily resource extraction economies. And so they have been impacted very significantly by what's going on with the oil and gas industry these days, not just in depressed prices, but in shifts to attitudes to wanting to wean further and further away from fossil fuels.
Mm-hmm.
Moving to the Ontario-Quebec market, very strong in terms of that manufacturing, finance, technology sector. So manufacturing in Canada has declined, but most recent purchasing managers index indicated that even though there's been a decline, that there is some optimism about manufacturing coming back and increasing. So that's going to help that market. And then you've got Atlantic Canada, which is, again, a resource economy, fishing, timber. So the differences between the markets and the geographies necessitate a different approach to fleet management. So if you go out west, vehicles required are often demanded to be all-wheel drive, four-wheel drive. That's where you're seeing that traditionally been that strong pickup market. Where in Ontario, you see more of that mixed fleet where folks are into some of the compact CUVs, mid-size CUVs, et cetera. The challenges to production are affecting everyone. The challenges also trickle down even into the maintenance and repair, which maintenance and repair costs in Canada and fleet are increasing. And in some cases, I've spoken to people, they're saying they're seeing increased costs of up to 30%. Not sure exactly what the delta is because I haven't proposed or haven't gone out and talked to everybody about this, but the consensus is certainly that they are rising along with new vehicle acquisition costs. I believe that that's something that the Canadian market is going to have to deal with for a long time as it's a systemic issue. So within there are some very distinct markets, and then it kind of leads into one of the questions that we're going to look at, which is EVs in fleet. And if you
Let's
look,
go into that.
sure, yeah. If you look at the province of Quebec, the province of Quebec is heavily invested in EV adoption. They have a mandate currently that 10 to 12% of all vehicles sold there are zero emission vehicles. Now they have some, as you said in an earlier podcast, devils in the details. They have some sub parts of that agreement that will let OEMs use credits from some of its hybrid vehicles and some of its even traditional ICE engines that have low emissions to get to that target. But they've mandated, similar to other states and countries, that by 2035, I believe they want to have 50% of all vehicles being EVs in that province. They're able to do it because they've been blessed with an abundance of hydroelectricity. And so they're using that to power not just the transition to electric vehicles, but they're also using that to power transition away from forced natural gas into electricity for heating homes. So that's having a big impact there, and they've got a lot of infrastructure development over there. So that's kind of driving EV sales. 50% of all EV sales in Canada go to Quebec, and EV sales in Canada are still driven to the provinces where there are provincial incentives, along with now we have a federal $5,000 incentive, which are stackable incentives. So in Quebec, I believe you can get upwards of $13,000 in incentives on electric vehicle. BC is got an incentive program. So we're seeing EV adoption increase. It's still in its nascent phase among fleets. There are some fleets who are kind of dipping a toe into EVs, where they're putting an executive or maybe part of the sales force into a Bolt, into a Leaf, into the Outlander. But the challenge for many fleets who have asked to go EV is that then it tends to butt up against some of their other requirements, where they say, we're out west, we want an EV, but it's got to be all-wheel drive. And my understanding is right now, the only company that meets that need is Tesla, with all-wheel or four-wheel drive. And then immediately that discounts them because it's above the spend that the fleet operator wants to use. So in its nascent stages, I think with the new administration in the States, it's aligning a lot with the federal government, the Liberal government, which is very, very bullish on green initiatives and the whole Build Back Better. So I think it will grow, but I believe it's still going to take a number of years to see it be more widely adopted for issues, not just of availability, but charging infrastructure and also electricity transmission and distribution infrastructure.
Okay. And then is Quebec the only province that has that buying mandate for zero emission vehicles?
I believe it's the only, I could be wrong. And if I am, then some other provinces, guys I know in other provinces, are going to kick me.
At the best of your knowledge, yes.
At the best of my knowledge, Quebec is the only one that's got a mandate for that currently.
Well, as we're approaching towards the end of our allotted time, another key area that I'd like to discuss is this whole impact of recreational marijuana, because that's legal in all Canadian provinces. In the US, it's certain states, not all states, and still illegal at the federal level. But from the Canadian perspective, what impact has the legalization of recreational marijuana had on fleet operations?
Well, I'm really glad you asked me that, but just before I answer that question, I was going to spark up this joint. It's actually seems to have been, there's a Shakespeare quote, much ado about nothing. There were a lot of concerns as medicinal marijuana morphed into recreational marijuana, in terms of driver safety and putting other drivers or environments at risk. Those haven't gone away, but my experience in talking to folks is after, I believe, 2 years now of legal recreational marijuana, the sky hasn't fallen. So fleet operators who have good policies around any kind of drug or alcohol use, they haven't been rushing out saying these are terrible. We need to redefine them. Of course, the challenges are, as you know, that if I want to sit and watch a Super Bowl, I can have 4 beers watching a Super Bowl, and when I go to work the next day, my blood alcohol level is going to be back to pre-drinking alcohol. Very different in terms of how the THC leaves your system. So there still are some questions about
Hmm.
that. I find it actually more interesting that there was a report that I saw the other day that the Liberal government is considering decriminalizing what in the US are your hard Schedule 1 drugs like cocaine and heroin, just because we're experiencing such high opioid deaths as a result of COVID. And one of the ways to try to reduce those is to decriminalize it so that the drugs that people are going to use are at least going to be of a quality that's not going to cause them to die when they use them. So
Right.
there's a lot left to be determined.
Yeah, I think the key thing in terms of the recreational marijuana is fleet policy. If you have an enforceable fleet policy in place, you're going to mitigate those risks that are involved. But with that, it's a good way to end our interview. We've reached our allotted time. I'd like to thank you again, Keith, for a great conversation and also for bringing in those demonstrations or props in your conversation. And I'd like to thank you again for joining us.
Well, I'm really glad that we ended our conversation on a high note.
Thank you, Keith. Talk to you
Thanks so
soon.
much, Mike.